We're back at it again, sports fans. After 2 games, we're going back to the past, back to the world of Metroid. Metroid Prime was released in 2002 as a co-development between American company Retro Studios, hence the America First release, and Nintendo for the GameCube, before being eventually re-released for the Wii in 2009 and remastered for the Nintendo Switch in 2023. It's considered one of the best Metroid games ever made, featuring the massive innovation of a first-person perspective and paving the way for open-ended 3D exploration, the likes of which were rarely seen beforehand and never with such powerful hardware. I'm going to make a bold claim right off the bat and say that Metroid Prime is a really good game. Do I think it's 97 out of 100 on Metacritic worthy? Maybe not, but still, it's a solid 7 out of 10 for me. Taking place between Metroid 1 and 2, Samus responds to a distress signal sent by a group of space pirates, only to find a monstrous parasite and a mechanized upgrade of her old foe Ridley assaulting the base. After destroying the parasite, Samus pursues Ridley to the nearby planet Talon 4, where the Chozo once made residence, only to discover that they've been wiped out by an unknown force. And that's it, at least in terms of direct storytelling. Metroid Prime basically pioneered the art of environmental storytelling, albeit in a rudimentary form. Instead of showing you things in the world and designing small vignettes or something a bit more elegant, you're given a scanning visor attachment, which gives you the option of reading a log explaining the environmental background details, which give way to the actual story. The Chozo on Talon 4 were wiped out by a meteorite containing a gelatinous radioactive substance known as Phazon, which was being emitted by a mutated and seemingly alpha member of the titular Metroid species, of which Samus has a distinct history, while the space pirates were filthy opportunists trying to break through the Chozo's final gambit barrier against this Metroid Prime creature to access the powerful and presumably valuable Phazon for profit or power. Samus comes in a little after the fact, with the Chozo dead and the space pirates basically all corrupted after multiple rounds of experimentation, where she ends up destroying the Metroid Prime and escaping the planet to battle another day. Now, I'm going to be honest, I didn't get any of that from the game itself. I was definitely picking up clues as I was playing. I understood that the space pirates were trying to get through the ancient Chozo temple barrier. I understood that the Phazon was a foreign and unwelcome invasive substance, etc. But never was there a click moment for me to put it all together. I got that real story from the wiki. Maybe you think that's my fault, and I wouldn't necessarily blame you, considering I stopped scanning everything pretty early into my playthrough because I was impatient, bluntly speaking. I'm not going to say that I met the game on its own terms, nor can I criticize the narrative for the way that it's presented. That said, one tiny little bit of criticism I have is that I would have liked a bit more upfront information to base some theories off of, or at least give me a direction to base my observations on. Like, even Super Metroid had a small text summary explaining what was happening leading up to the start of the game's story, but in Prime, all we get is that Samus is answering a distress signal. Like, yeah, I agree that spotting Ridley is usually a bad thing, but with the whole mystery of the Chozo and Phazon, we're left completely in the dark save for those scannable objects. I don't mind doing 95% of the work, but I think the reason I elected not to do that 95% on my own by not scanning everything is because the game didn't do its due diligence in giving me a hook to go off of in doing that first 5%. That said, it is a Metroid game, so the story is like negative priority. Let's talk about Talon 4. We've talked about how Metroidvanias generally operate, and you might be surprised to hear that this remains true even going into 3D. I was actually quite taken with the early exploration. It had been a while since I played a wholly new Metroidvania, and this early portion of the game really reignited my love of the genre, the excitement to finding new paths, making mental notes about areas to come back to, discovering new upgrades, etc. But then that's not really surprising. The Metroid series has always been good in this regard, and I'm not shocked that Prime retained that quality. What I was surprised about was in remembering my feelings towards Super Metroid. In that critique, I complained about the lack of innovation in Samus's kit, with over half of the upgrades being repeats from the original Metroid. Well, aside from the 2 visors, the spider ball, and a few optional super missile variants, every single upgrade in Metroid Prime was repeated from earlier titles. You have the Wave Beam, Ice Beam, and Plasma Beam. You have a double jump, which is functionally identical to the high jump boots in terms of what it means for exploration. You have the Varia and Gravity suits, and while the Phazon suit is technically new, its only required use that I could find was in getting one of the endgame artifacts, so I don't really count it as an upgrade. And yet, most, if not all of these upgrades felt surprisingly fresh. To me, it's a testament to the advantages of the shift in perspective. All of these items have brand new context thanks to the expansion to 3D, or if not new contexts, then expanded contexts. It's a matter of having to actively move the camera to find these opportunities that makes all the difference in the world to me. It makes discovering these opportunities all the more fun and rewarding when I actually find something in a big room. For example, there was a moment later on into my run where I was going back through an early area, and I randomly tried to use the Morph Ball boost on this platform. I had assumed that it was just like an alternate way to get up onto this higher ledge for those still in the Morph Ball while traveling, but when I rose higher and higher, I noticed a hole in the left-hand side. Sure, it was just a missile pack, and sure, this is both a pretty standard secret, and also I'm a dumbass for not investigating it when I first got the boost, but the excitement felt real and earned to me in the moment. And I do want to stress that this was a very standard secret, especially in the context of a Metroidvania. This kind of thing is incredibly common to the genre, but again, it's a matter of actively looking around and noticing something that made the difference to me. Now, that's not to say it's all good, because not all power-ups were created equal. Namely, the spider ball, grapple beam, the visors, and the various beams all have their problems, in my opinion. To start simply, the only real problem I have with the beams is that they were underutilized as exploratory power-ups. The start and end of their application across the board is in opening different colored doors, which for some reason respawn with their unique colors when the doors close, instead of just turning into normal doors like they do in other Metroid games. I mean, I guess that makes it simpler to remember generally which point in the game any given area was explored, but if they wanted that, maybe just stick to the first door going into an area, and then don't have a wave beam door locked behind an ice beam door, which you get later for no other reason than to force a switch and waste a few seconds. Hi, yeah, Future Sight here. I definitely did forget about those wave beam things that you need the thermal visor to see, you know, from the underwater frigate. I definitely did forget about them, but they suck, and that's why I forgot about them, because I was so fucking traumatized by the underwater frigate section that I just really didn't want to think about that when I was scripting, apparently. But I did want to make that addendum. The wave beam specifically does have a little bit of exploratory depth to it. It just wasn't very good. But anyway, that's all I got for you. Back to the regular scripting without all the ums and uhs and yeah, okay, bye. On the exploratory aspect in general, yeah, you don't do anything interesting with the beams. Even Super Metroid had this game beat on that front by having you use the ice beam to make temporary platforms out of enemies in some areas to get around. Still, I will give them the benefit of the doubt because 3D is really, really hard. But then we come to the visors, and that benefit is revoked because these things suck ass. You start out with two, the combat visor and the scanning visor, and unlock both the thermal visor and the X-ray visor later on. These are fine enough additions on paper, but their implementation is dog water. Not only do they make looking at the screen almost unbearable, but how they interact with exploration is really, really toxic in my opinion. Just think about it. The X-ray visor lets you see through breakable walls. This is how the game expects you to find breakable walls. There is no consistent indication otherwise, meaning that theoretically, you should have the X-ray visor on whenever possible because you just never know where one might be. On a first playthrough, you don't know that, contrary to how some other Metroidvanias use breakable walls. Metroid Prime only has a few instances of this mechanic appearing, and only 2 required instances of it, with one being the room you obtain it, and the other being a late-game artifact in a tower. On the thermal visor, it's another one that's just boring. I can't think of a single puzzle involving it or environmental benefit of using it. It's pretty much strictly used for combat, as some enemies can turn invisible or fight you in pitch-black rooms, forcing you to use the thermal to lock on onto them. Though this is arguably worse with the late game X-ray enemies because the X-ray visor looks awful, but that's neither here nor there. The grapple is a late game item that I was looking forward to the whole game, not just as a means of finding new paths, but also because I kept seeing these stupid grapple points in the Magmoor caverns that would make getting through that area for the 1000th time a little quicker. However, when I got it, I found that the implementation was wonky. Your camera has to be generally pointed to the grapple point, and with how the camera controls in this game, having to hold the R trigger and move the left stick, preventing you from moving while looking around, doing that is harder than it would be in some other first-person games. That wouldn't be too bad if the prompt to grapple wasn't so seemingly inconsistent. Now, I don't think that's actually true. I'm inclined to say that it's entirely consistent because this is a Nintendo subsidiary game with close to Nintendo level polish, but I disagree with where the prompt appears. I think, and don't quote me on this was just based on vibes as I was playing, that the icon doesn't appear if you are at or above the grapple point, which is is entirely feasible if you use the double jump. Something that I can definitely point to though is the range of the thing. It's fairly short, so you need to be near the grapple point, as you should be for balancing reasons. But then you have these moving grapple points later on, and instead of properly timing the grapple to attach when the platform is near to you, you wait for the prompt when the point is close, and then Samus shoots the beam, which travels an insane distance as the grapple keeps moving out of normal range because, it's moving. And for some reason, that works. Like I said, almost Nintendo levels of polish. Finally, the Spider Ball, which is easily my least favorite power-up in the game. Metroid is naturally a slow series. Prime differs slightly in that with the frantic nature of the combat, but the general flow remains the same. That said, there's a difference between slow and glacial, and the Spider Ball crosses that line for me. There's a couple problems here, first and foremost being the lack of dynamism. Imagine if the beam or visor upgrades didn't have their combat utility, they were just used for opening doors or such. That's the Spider Ball. You follow preset tracks with almost no challenge or execution required, other than figuring out which direction the game wants you to press given the wonky camera. At best, you'll have to time dropping to an alternate track, or there's a single more open sequence of Spider Ball shenanigans that I can remember. But for the most part, it's nothing of the sort. Linear paths with little to no variation. Problem the second is that the Spider Ball is just slow and boring. You're not excited when you get the Spider Ball. It doesn't open the map in the same way that the Space Jump or Grapple Beam do, and it doesn't have a lick of combat utility on top of that. Maybe in the future you could get a special beam to go with the Spider Ball, and if you connect the beam to an enemy, you're sucked onto the enemy in your Spider Ball form, where you can then bomb them. I could see some fun stuff being used in that way. But then speaking of exploration, let's talk about that. There are around half a dozen areas to explore in Metroid Prime, each with their own zones and mini areas that you'll need to systematically scrub through to get your required items. This is no different than any other Metroid game, really, with about the same scale when it comes to the number of explorable rooms. My issue is one that I had with Super Metroid before it, which is the backtracking. Unlike Super Metroid, I had never played Metroid Prime before making this video, so I went in completely blind. For better or worse, I used the game's default hints system, which gave a pop-up on the map after a while of blind exploring, telling you which room you can use your most recent power-up in to continue progression. I'm not sure how the general public feels about this system, but I thought it worked fairly well with some small missteps in execution, namely that the pop-up didn't fucking go away until it was manually checked by the player, even if they didn't want or need it, which made it a time waster. However, in the grand scheme of things, this isn't an issue. But what I have to assume is the intended route through the game is what bothers me. Almost to the letter, you discover a power-up, and the game wants you to go to the complete opposite side of the world in a whole different area to use it. I can't tell you how many times I went through Magmoor Caverns, which is the connecting zone that bridges the rest of them. After a certain point, it became actively frustrating to go through the game how it wanted me to go through it, because I knew I'd spend half of my time backtracking and the other half actually having fun exploring new areas. And I'm absolutely positive that there are a bunch of sequence breaks and optimizations that could be made to lighten this load. And in fact, I know that this is the case given the length of the remastered speedrun compared to my own time. But again, we're looking at these games from a casual, first time or second time perspective. I don't think it's unreasonable to say that most players will go where the game tells them to go on their first playthrough, and I think this level of backtracking does nothing but disincentivize players to do a second playthrough. The funny part of it is that the probable cause of my frustration is due to a feature that I otherwise like, which is the hint system itself. In general, giving a player a nudge in the right direction is a safe bet when it comes to player agency. In this case, you're led to the start of a new sequence or area and left completely on your own to get through it, retaining a sense of forward momentum. This is something that I think more games should do, although perhaps more diegetically than a random blip signal that Samus somehow detected in her visor. This would be the benefit of NPCs, or maybe a more incentivized scanning system to provide the player those diegetic hints. In any case, the world design of Metroid Prime makes it so that about 5 minutes after you get a new power-up, you're directed across the entire game world to get the next one, and after a point, it becomes exhausting, and it even threatened to ruin the fun of using the thing you just got. Most of these power-ups only have a few uses, as we've gone over. This is made even worse when you have to do 10 minutes of backtracking to even get to make the most out of it, since you rarely need to do much to get back on the main path after you get said upgrade on one of those paths, leaving its applications to the next area you're supposed to go. A quick fix for this in small bursts would be to have 2 power-ups in a single area, where you have to use one to get to the other. Then you could have 2 paths to go down once you get out of that area, corresponding to each power power-up. Or you could receive a power-up early on in a new path, but getting the power-up blocks off your return route, so you have to get through the entire area by utilizing said power-up, kind of like a larger scale version of the X-ray visor room. In a lot of ways, it feels like Metroid Prime is just 1 or 2 steps off of being a truly fantastic Metroidvania experience for my preferences. It's just all of these little annoyances and the sheer amount of backtracking on a first playthrough that bothers me so much. And I hate to keep harping on the same point over and over, but this is the game, man. You'll spend more time going back and forth through Magmoor Caverns and the main paths of the other areas than you will exploring new and exciting areas. It's ridiculous. As well, there are a few things that Metroid Prime is just bad at. Not many, but a few, most egregiously being the bosses. I would also kind of mention the muddy visuals, and I did sort of mention the, camera control before, but there's a remaster that fixes both of those, so it would be a moot point to complain about either one of those further. Anyway, the bosses. Unfortunately, the jump to 3D offered new but equally frustrating issues for this series, making these bosses almost as bad as those seen in the previously looked at Super Metroid. There are technically a lot of bosses, but many are smaller and more akin to minis, so we're only going to go over the main boss of each area. Aside from the Parasite Queen in the tutorial, the first major boss you fight is Flagra in the Chozo Ruins, which gives you the Varia suit needed to explore Magmoor Caverns. This is the only boss that I like definitively, because it fits Metroid's strengths much more than the mostly action-based focus of the others. In short, it's a puzzle boss where you're given a few factors that you have to figure out. In 4 phases, you have to stun the boss to ensure that it doesn't interrupt you, knock these artificial light beam things out of alignment, which paralyzes Flagra, before going through these portholes that are now free to bomb its roots. It's a fight of management, which I usually like. You're having to actively watch for when Flagra comes out of its stun state to put it back in to continue the process in later phases, and it's overall just a good time. In the Phendrana Drifts, the next boss you fight is Thardus, or what would later be known as a Breath of the Wild Talus, where you get the power bomb. This enemy sees the first instance of the use of visors in combat, where you're expected to use the thermal visor to locate and expose a weak point before switching to your combat visor to actually attack it. Without fail, visor implementation in combat is awful, and that's down to how disorienting it is to play with both thermal and later the X-ray visor equipped. It hurts my eyes, I don't have fun using it, and I just wish I didn't have to use it. Thankfully, Thardus, in particular, is a time when I don't. And something that I really like, you can actually skip the thermal visor phase by using bombs when it rolls around, both speeding up the fight immensely and overall making it feel a lot more dynamic and exciting by cutting out the puzzle portion. Though, note, this is about as far towards the action spectrum as I want these bosses to go, and that wish is not granted. The Omega Pirate boss happens many hours after the last one, being basically the 4th to last thing you do in the game. Deep in the Phazon mines, this is where you get the Phazon suit, which I previously mentioned is kind of useless. That's already a knock against this boss in my book, but this thing is just awful regardless. I didn't mention this in regards to Thardus because it ultimately wasn't very egregious there, but the animations on these bosses are paradoxically overtuned and undertuned, both to extremes. To start with the undertuned, since it applies more to the Omega Pirates, it has the ability to absorb beam attacks with this glowy thing that it does with its hand. On paper, this isn't too bad. It incentivizes different weapon use, or whatever you want to say about it. My issue with it though is that the animation for when the absorption effect is active isn't consistent. I have fired plenty of weapons at the boss's weak points, these glowing spots on its knees and shoulders, only for those attacks to be absorbed by a glowy absorption effect that isn't actually visible yet. It makes trying to predict when we can actually attack the boss a complete nightmare, unless it's exactly during his shockwave attack, which lasts 1,000 years. But ultimately, that's small potatoes compared to the unreal hitbox issues that we have here. Like I said before, the Omega Pirate has these weak spots that are plainly visible. You would think with the usually good lock-on system that the game implements, that hitting these would be the easiest thing in the world, and the difficulty would be in surviving long enough to get those shots off. In an ideal world, this would be exactly what it is, because the Omega Pirate hits very hard, and the fight is relatively long thanks to that size and power. Unfortunately, it's made 10 times worse because trying to hit these things is a nightmare. Even with super missiles in their apparent area of effect upon impact, I had a hell of a time trying to land clean shots shots on these things. It seems like the shots were almost magnetized to the armored parts of the Omega Pirate's body, instead of homing onto the actual targets that I was locked onto. Again, that's totally vibes based though. That said, this is made even worse by the overtuned animations, where the slightest twitch will block your targets and cause you to waste your shot. To fix, less twitching, more subdued animations, or a better tracking system. That's what this boss needed. And that's not even going over the use of the X-ray visor, which unlike with Thardus is not optional. Oh, and just to add another cherry on top, this one also summons random space pirates to harass you throughout the entire fight, some of which are arguably more threatening than the boss, specifically the power beam variants, which can only really be effectively killed with super missiles, a finite resource. Note, effectively. I absolutely hate this boss. It is by far the worst one in the game, and I really don't look forward to fighting it again if I ever choose to play through Metroid Prime a second time. As for the second to last thing you do, the main hook if you want to call it that, is that Ridley is somehow back from the dead after the events of Metroid 1. Samus pursues him down to Talon 4, and his presence has been, well, I wouldn't say a looming threat, but he does show up now and then and is casting a really big shadow over whatever area you're in. Just before you're about to go into the final area and final boss, Ridley appears and you have to fight him. I'm gonna be honest here, I have nothing interesting to say about this fight. It's not particularly bad, and it's not particularly good, and it doesn't have anything truly unique to set it apart, other than these random sections where Ridley flies away and you have to just wait for him to come back. Honestly, the Ridley fight's just boring in this game, so I think we're gonna move on. The final boss then is the titular Metroid Prime, which is a Metroid that has been heavily mutated by the Phazon, and it's presumably the source of this blight that wiped out the Chozo race on this planet. Its first phase is actually pretty good, where it continually switches its affinity to your different beams, forcing you to use them all. For some reason, it really gravitated toward the Ice Beam, the worst one because zero tracking, making its tight hitbox and equally overtuned animations annoying at times, but really it's fine. It's a bit long, but overall this is a good encounter. However, Phase 2 is arguably worse than even the Omega Pirates. You have to use all of your visors this time, barring the scanned visor. You have to contend with different breeds of Metroid being summoned instead of space pirates, and you can only damage it when you have the correct visor equipped and when you're standing in the Phazon pools it generates, which are often swarmed by Metroids. This is peak throw everything but the kitchen sink game design, and I can't abide by it. The Metroid Prime encounter uses everything you ever obtained save for the spider ball in its boss fights, but instead of carefully tuning the boss and or peeling back some features to make it a more palatable experience, you just have to suffer. In theory, this use everything mentality makes sense, especially for a Metroidvania, but this only works when you're being tested in your use of these items' unique mechanics, and the items in this game simply don't have unique mechanics worth talking about. You're not freezing parts of its body with the ice beam to get a clear shot at the eye. You're not actually using the stun effect of the wave beam for anything useful. You aren't finding hidden paths with the X-ray visor to reach Phazon pools to damage the second phase. Nothing. It's bare bones, it's tedious, and it's actively frustrating having to constantly switch between these interchangeable messes of tools. Overall, these bosses are just a colossal failure. It's absolutely crazy to me that the Metroid series has not realized by now that action isn't its forte. It's essentially a large-scale puzzle game where you slowly put pieces together as you get new items. Why don't more of the bosses fit into this mold? And while the Metroid Prime boss really soured me on the whole ending sequence, specifically the second phase, what started that process was the most baffling decision I've seen yet in this retrospective: the artifact quest. Soon into the game, you gain access to this Chozo artifact site that seems kinda important. It has a cutscene attached, you scan these things that have their own section in the log entries. Must be cool. However, what many might write off as optional content, given how out of the way and vague it is, may be disappointed when, after the Phazon suit upgrade, you're directed to said artifact site, where you're expected to read these clues in the log entries, traverse through the entire world again, and collect these 12 artifacts before you're allowed to access the final boss. Be honest, does anyone like this? I'm genuinely curious if you do, because I just don't see it. At best, it's a neat thing you can do to get most of these throughout the adventure on a second playthrough and beyond, but why sacrifice the pacing of the first playthrough for that? I just don't get it, especially in a game that's already so inundated with backtracking. Now, ultimately, this wasn't too bad, all things considered. It was about 2 hours of work, and the puzzles once you actually get into the rooms range from just whatever to genuinely fun and engaging. So again, not not all bad. Here's how I would have done it though. Early on, force the player to go to the site and download all of the data logs. Then whenever you enter a room with an artifact, play a little jingle, like a very obvious one. Eventually, the player will associate that with the artifacts and start looking, or go into their logbook for the clue it gives. And sometimes they may need to come back later with another item. The central pillar in that one Magmoor Caverns room comes to mind for that. This way, the player is looking for them throughout the game, with maybe only a few left to collect in the end game, making the worldwide jaunt a bit more manageable. For the purposes of our retrospective, Metroid Prime is interesting for a number of reasons. Not only is it a 3D Metroidvania, already an outlier, but it's in the first-person perspective. I've already gone over the benefits of this, namely the new and exciting context for existing items in a franchise, but I'm skeptical about this perspective's potential in the genre. 3D, absolutely, but the first-person perspective is good for a very specific number of genres. And while Metroid was definitely the franchise to do it out of all Metroidvania IPs, I don't think there was much more they could do here without sacrificing the perspective or the integrity of the items or environments. I've heard that things like the screw attack make a return in the later Prime games, so maybe they found a way that I'm not seeing, but I do think Metroidvanias work best when you can see your character in full, whether in 2D or 3D. Not only does it offer more reward when you get a visual upgrade, such as the different suits here in the Metroid series, but the freedom you have when not shackled to the first-person perspective is something that Metroidvanias can take advantage of more than most other genres. That said, overall, Metroid Prime is still a good game. I'd say it's great even, if not for the copious amounts of backtracking and horrible boss lineup. The moment-to-moment gameplay, especially when exploring new areas, is oftentimes great, better than the other Metroid game I played thanks to tight controls and fun new context for its item use. This is where I would normally end the video, but I want to try something a little bit different. See, as of writing this part of the script, I am far from an expert on many of these games. Even Metroid Prime, I only played through once to write this entire video. Some of you may point out that this sort of defeats the point of Metroidvania. A lot of the appeal of the genre is in replaying them and finding faster ways to get to that endgame power state after all. While I think it's important to give the perspective of a first-time player when I can, I think it's equally important to give a perspective of someone with a more experienced view of whatever is being discussed. So, for games in this series that I have not played before the video, I will be doing a full second playthrough in order to reevaluate my thoughts from that perspective, and then share those at the end of the normal video. The footage you see on screen is from that second playthrough, which you'll notice looks a lot better than the rest of the footage. Yeah, I played the remaster, and I have some thoughts, though they aren't particularly complicated, so we'll get through them quickly. I've heard that the remaster removes or makes harder a lot of the speedrunning tech that existed in the original game, but honestly, I don't care. The game looks gorgeous, has twin stick controls for better aiming and searching functionality, and is in my opinion the definitive way to play this game for 95% of people. The sole thing that I disliked is the way that you switch beams, which is by holding X and using a directional button, where you switch visors by using a directional button without holding X. This means that you can't switch beams while moving, making the little annoyance of having to constantly switch beams while backtracking through areas just that little bit more annoying. In the game's defense, there is an option to switch the controls for visor and beam switching, so beams would no longer require an X hold, but that doesn't fix the problem, as minor as it is. That's literally the only thing I can complain about when it comes to the remaster though. A small note about the graphics as well, the cleaner and brighter appearance has the side effect of making a lot of the environmental puzzles a lot more fun. The muddy visuals of the original made many secrets difficult to spot even when you were looking, which was fixed in the remaster and was much appreciated. On to the second playthrough thoughts. Knowing where to go and how to effectively get around, I'll say that the backtracking is just as bad as I complained about. As I suspected, there's significantly less of it now that I know where all of the artifacts are and can get most of them before the final hunt, but it doesn't change the fact that this was insufferable on the first playthrough and probably should have had a major rework. That said, one thing that I didn't appreciate on that first playthrough, due to streaming at the time, was the interconnectedness of the levels. Namely, there were more shortcuts than I realized, and these usually took you close to where you were supposed to end up to progress through the game, such as the shortcut in the Ice Beam save room back to the Talon overworld to get to the sunken frigate, which leads to the Phazon Mine, your next story destination. So yes, there was significantly less backtracking once I knew where to go, but the backtracking itself was still annoying. The fact that enemies continue continually respawn annoyed me more on this playthrough than the first. There's no functional reason to have the X-ray pirates appear in half of the Chozo Ruins rooms later in the game. There's no reason for pirates and turrets to come back during your second, third, fourth trip through the Phazon mines or Magmore caverns. Enemies that you can just run through when backtracking are completely fine in my book, but these are enemies that you have to stop and deal with, interrupting the exploration for no real purpose. It's fake tension. That's about all I have to say, however. My thoughts on the game remained pretty much the same on the second playthrough, which is to say that I think it's a strong 7 out of 10. A good game, but not one of my favorites. Up next, we flip-flop back to the other prominent originator of the genre, with what many consider to be the best of its franchise, Castlevania: Aria of Sorrow. Time to fight the evils of man once again.